Good evening. Hi, welcome to UT Law School. I see a lot of people from outside the law school, which is really great. We're glad to have you here at the law school. It really is a great pleasure for me to be here tonight, and I know we started a little bit late, so I won't spend too much time up here. But first, I'd really like to thank the people who've been instrumental in making this happen, and starting with Mayor Brown. A law firm has an office all over the nation and the world, including one right here in Texas, and particularly Gary Isaac. I'd also like to thank the Strauss Center, the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law, in particular Laura and Jill, who've been working really hard. The Texas Journal on Civil Liberties and Civil Rights, Abbas and Lydia have worked very hard. The Individual Rights and Responsibilities section of the Texas State Bar, and people here at UT who have worked tirelessly, Laura Castro, Donald Dodson, and Charles Medlock. Thank you very much. As I said, it's really, for me, it's a great honor to be here with Chaplain Yee and Gary Isaac, who's going to speak briefly later. I began representing Guantanamo detainees in 2002. Really just about 6 months after 9/11. Some of you law students were probably in junior high at that time, so you don't remember, but it was really a country filled with fear, and representing a Guantanamo detainee was a lonely place to be. And there were not many lawyers who were really willing to do that, but my great colleagues at Sherman and Sterling were willing to do that, and we began representing detainees, filing a suit alongside Center for Constitutional Rights in New York in 2002, and what became known as the Rasul v. Bush case. We, of course, lost at the district court, lost at the circuit court, and really at that point in time we were just arguing simply that the detainees at Guantanamo should have some sort of due process, should have some right to have their case heard or to be able to challenge their detention in a fair process. And the government, of course, was claiming that they had no rights whatsoever, that it was Guantanamo, and that they were foreign citizens. So we lost several times and petitioned the Supreme Court for cert, which basically is a request to have the Supreme Court hear the case. And everyone thought that we weren't going to get cert granted. But lo and behold, we did. And that was when I first met Gary Isaac in 2003. And up until then, it really was, as I've mentioned, a very lonely road with people questioning my patriotism and my sanity, which may still be questioned, but really calling the people who were working on Guantanamo issues traitors and enemy combatants themselves who should be locked up at Guantanamo. So when Gary came along with his big law firm and offered to help in the Supreme Court case, it was a tremendous thing to have more big law firms working with us. And so Gary and his colleagues wrote an amicus brief on behalf of retired military officers, and that was really just the beginning of Mayor Brown's involvement in the Guantanamo situation, and also in the war on terrorism here at home. Mayor Brown, and with Gary leading the charge, also submitted an amicus brief on behalf of Janet Reno in the Al-Mari case. Al-Mari is a legal U.S. resident who was picked up in Illinois and held as an enemy combatant. Is that right? And I'm sorry?
His home in Peoria.
At his home, from his home, and held as an enemy combatant. Gary has also worked very hard on other amici, most recently coordinating the amici effort in the Al-Oda Boumediene case, which the Supreme Court recently heard in December, and will soon decide just exactly what kind of rights those people, they're people, we can call them detainees, that might make it easier, but they're really people, they're human beings just like you and I, what kind of rights they have at Guantanamo. And so without further ado, I will give you Gary, and then I will introduce Chaplain Yee later.
Thank you, Christine. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased that Mayor Brown is a co-sponsor of this event. As Christine mentioned, Mayor Brown has been involved in the Guantanamo litigation since around the summer of 2003, when we submitted an amicus brief in support of the cert petition in the Supreme Court in the Rasul case, urging the Supreme Court to take the case. And I'm happy and proud to say that there are now hundreds of lawyers around the country who are deeply involved in this work, giving up of their time and their money and their souls to do this work. We have Dickie Grigg is here, one of the other habeas counsel. Dickie, where are you? It's really a great honor to work with these hundreds of lawyers at large firms, solo practitioners who are working on this because they think it's so important. The Guantanamo litigation is really about the most fundamental issues that we have as a society. It's about separation of powers. It's about checks and balances. It's about executive authority. It's about judicial review. All these bedrock principles that you learn about, not just in law school, but in going back to junior high school or elementary school, all of those principles have been at stake in this case, in this litigation. And I actually remember, and Christine was there too, being at the oral argument in the Rasul case in 2004, and the lawyers were literally, and I literally mean literally arguing about Magna Carta and the Federalist Papers. And it's pretty extraordinary to be in the Supreme Court and hear argument about Magna Carta and the Federalist Papers. And the case involves all three branches of the government. It involves obviously the president who created Guantanamo. It involves the courts who have stepped in to some extent, and the Supreme Court, which has asserted jurisdiction over these cases. And most recently it involves the Congress, which attempted in the Military Commissions Act in 2006 to strip the courts of jurisdiction, a rather extraordinary action on behalf of by the Congress. The constitutionality of that statute is what is before the court, the Supreme Court in the Boumediene case, which is under review right now. At its core, habeas corpus is about a very, very simple proposition, and that is that the king or the president cannot lock up anyone on his own say-so without having an independent court look at whether there is a factual and a legal basis for putting the person in prison. That's it at its core. It's that simple. But that is what we're fighting about for the detainees at Guantanamo, is just the right to have a day in court, a fair hearing before an independent judge to determine whether or not there's any basis for holding them as individuals. Habeas corpus, as you all know, is actually enshrined in our Constitution, not in the Bill of Rights, in the original Constitution. And habeas corpus really is the source of all of our civil liberties and our civil rights. Think about it. If the president could just throw you in jail without having a court review it, what would our other civil liberties mean? What would it mean to have freedom of speech or freedom to assemble or freedom of the press if there was no ability to go to court and assure that if you are subject to detention, if the president tries to lock you up, that you have a court to say, no, you cannot do that. That's against the law. And the founders did recognize this, as I said, that it is enshrined in the Constitution. And I just want to read you two quotes which to me are very, very evocative of how important and how fundamental habeas corpus is. And they're both courtesy of the wonderful brief that was written by, among others, Christine's former colleagues at Sherman and Sterling in Washington, D.C. And first is in terms of how important habeas corpus is to our civil liberties and to our whole system of politics and democracy, is from Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural. He said, "Freedom of the person under the protection of the habeas corpus I deem one of the essential principles of our government." And the second quote is from a more recent president, Dwight Eisenhower, who said in 1953, "Why are we proud? We are proud, first of all, because from the beginning of this nation, a man can walk upright no matter who he is. He can walk upright and meet his friend or his enemy and he does not fear that because that enemy may be in a position of great power, that he can be suddenly thrown in jail to rot there without charges and with no recourse to justice. We have the Habeas Corpus Act, and we respect it. Well, we've passed the 6th anniversary of the detainees, the first detainees being brought to Guantanamo, and they are still there without any charges ever having been brought against them, without ever having a fair hearing to determine whether there's a basis for holding them. They've been locked up away from their families, and we will find out when the Supreme Court decides the Boumediene case whether we still do have the Habeas Corpus Act and whether we do, in fact, still respect it. Now we're going to hear from Chaplain Yi, who comes here as a witness to what has happened at Guantanamo and as someone who has himself been accused of wrongdoing and had the benefit, fortunately, of legal process so that he could respond to the accusations against him, and here he is. But Christine, I think, is going to introduce Chaplain Yi formally. Thank you very much.
It really is my great pleasure to have Chaplain James Yi here. And I think it's one of the reasons, as I think Gary pointed out, is because people sort of think about Guantanamo and habeas corpus and the detainees, and they say, oh, that's those people. That's those people. That's not going to happen to me. But Chaplain James Yi is a former U.S. military officer, and he is a U.S. citizen. And he spent time at Guantanamo as the chaplain to the detainees there, and trying to bring some real solutions for the plight of the detainees there. He expressed his concern to his commanders, objected to the treatment of the detainees, and in fact, though he was commended twice, he was, upon leaving Guantanamo, arrested. He will tell you more about that, but he was arrested and held for 76 days in a Navy brig without a lawyer. So you can say, oh, habeas corpus, that's, who cares, it's for the detainees, it doesn't matter, I'm okay. But the truth is that in this culture, when we have a culture of fear about the war on terrorism, the most innocent, the most honorable people like Chaplain Yi can get caught up and accused wrongly. And yes, he had the benefit of a legal process, but not immediately. And thank goodness, though, that he eventually had a legal process. And that, to me, is something that this country stands for. And so we need to remember that. And I think Chaplain Yi is a great illustration of what this country stands for. So please welcome Chaplain Yi.
Thank you very much for having me here today. It's really an honor and pleasure to actually be here and have the opportunity to share with all of you my experience. And I'm very grateful that the school here is taking steps to really raise issues about Guantanamo and the whole controversy that exists over this prison camp today. Because I think it's one of the very, very important issues of the day, especially after 9/11. And in my view, Guantanamo is a very, very dark spot that will be forever on the history of our country. And that's a problem. But let me first start by giving you a little bit more of a short background of myself. A third-generation Chinese American. It was my grandparents who immigrated here to the United States. Both of my parents were born here in the U.S. I'm a West Point graduate. I graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1990. And I'm a former soldier, former officer who has now served in 2 of our nation's conflicts. First in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, and then in Operation Enduring Freedom when I was serving down in Guantanamo. But not only am I a West Point graduate and former military, but I also have a younger brother who is also a West Point graduate. I have a second younger brother who is also in the military, today serving on active duty right here in this state in Texas at Fort Hood as a doctor, an Army doctor. And my father, who I mentioned, was also born here in the U.S., also served in the U.S. military when he was drafted during World War II. So the military culture is now rooted in my family. And that's something we're all proud of with regard to each of our individual contributions towards this nation's security. Not only am I former military, but I'm also a Muslim convert. So I converted to Islam in 1991, not long after I graduated West Point. And that's a very important part of my life experience, as it would then set up how I would then go and become a Muslim chaplain serving in the ranks of our armed forces. And I wish I also had the time today to go into my journey to Islam and what inspired me about my reconfirmation of believing in one God. But today, because of the time constraints, I really need to focus on Guantanamo and the issues that occurred on my own personal ordeal. But it was after converting to Islam when I was in the military that then led me to study it traditionally, going overseas, learning a little bit of the Arabic language, studying Islam traditionally, and then coming back in January of 2001, not as an air defense artillery officer as I had first served, but now as a Muslim chaplain. This was in January of 2001. I was the newest Muslim chaplain to enter the ranks, one of about 10 or 12 at the time. And it was only 9 months later that we all experienced the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center, on the Pentagon, the United 93 flight which went down in Pennsylvania. All of that happened, we know, on September 11th, 2001. At that particular time, I was a Muslim chaplain serving the U.S. Army. Immediately following those attacks, I was someone who immediately stated publicly that those who carried out these attacks, whether they were Muslim or whether they were not Muslim, had to be brought to justice, because they had essentially targeted innocent civilians. It wasn't long after these attacks that I was then approached by senior level leaders in the military on my base, on the installation where I was serving, who tasked me to begin holding lectures, briefings, training sessions about Islam and the Muslim culture to those who were serving in the ranks, to soldiers, to U.S. service members. After 9/11, many of these soldiers had questions about Islam. Well, after 9/11, many Americans had questions about Islam. But as a Muslim chaplain in the ranks, my audience were those who were serving. And I began to hold these briefings and training sessions. And I answered the many questions for these soldiers about Islam, and many of them came away with a better understanding. I sort of speculated about why I was tasked to do this. And I think it was because senior level leaders in the military, immediately following 9/11, knew that our soldiers were going to be deployed to Muslim countries like Afghanistan. Perhaps they even knew at that particular time they would also be eventually deployed to Iraq and other Muslim nations. But nevertheless, I took up this tasking, held these training sessions, held these briefings, and then began to receive praise and recognition for that contribution. I was being characterized as someone who was building bridges, who was educating our soldiers to be better service members by learning about Islam and the Muslim cultures before they would be deployed to these Muslim countries. This praise came from the highest levels within the Pentagon and also in the State Department. And I believe it was this recognition and praise that would then get me handpicked, specifically chosen to be the Muslim chaplain down in Guantanamo Bay. This was in November of 2002 when I was first sent to Guantanamo, assigned to be the Muslim chaplain of this prison camp. The controversial prison camp where at that time some 660 or so individuals were being held in the war on terror. Each and every one of them a Muslim. Well, I again speculated. Why was I being sent to Guantanamo as a Muslim chaplain? I speculated that the real reason behind me going to Guantanamo was so that our government could say publicly that yes, we did have these 660 or so Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo, but that we also had down in Guantanamo our U.S. Army Muslim chaplain. And that would be an indication to the world, to the international community, that we were treating these prisoners humanely, that we were being very sensitive to the religious needs, to the religious faith of these Muslim prisoners. I speculated that maybe that was the real reason behind me being sent to Guantanamo. Well, maybe that was the reason. Or maybe it wasn't the reason. But when I got to Guantanamo, I learned I had two definitive roles. The first role was to be an advisor to the camp commander of this prison camp, to advise on religion and how religion affected this operation, how the religious practices, the religious observances of these Muslim prisoners affected the detention operation. That was the first role that I had. The second role that I had was to be a chaplain to all of the Muslims who were down in Guantanamo. Not only these 660 or so Muslim prisoners, but a chaplain also to the many American Muslims who were down in Guantanamo. Many American Muslims, civilian and military, who were working, also assigned to this joint task force prison operation. Imagine, with a population of almost 700 prisoners, who at that time represented about 40 different nations, there were many, many, many languages spoken in this camp. Languages like Arabic, Pashto, Farsi, Urdu, Dari, Turkish, other European languages, including French, German, Russian. Who handled these linguistic needs of this military operation? Translators. American translators, most of whom were American Muslims. And these American Muslims were essentially my congregation, so to speak, down in Guantanamo. When I conducted our Muslim Friday prayer service, it was the American Muslims who I was a chaplain to. But I was also a chaplain to those Muslim prisoners being held in Guantanamo. I was granted by the command in this capacity, authorized, unescorted access into these prison cell blocks. I was one of the very few individuals who was allowed to interact freely, speak freely, and listen to these prisoners held in Guantanamo. Maybe most importantly, listening to these prisoners. Because as we would say in the military, a good chaplain is a good listener. And that's what I would do as a chaplain. Simply focus my work, focus my efforts on listening to these Muslim prisoners being held in Guantanamo. And what would I hear from them? Well, I would learn very clearly, very thoroughly about some of the realities of what goes on inside this prison camp. Not only in the detention operation, but also in the intelligence gathering operation. For in Guantanamo, there are two missions: detention and intelligence gathering. The detention operation is run by military police, guards, who handle the everyday needs of these prisoners. They bring the prisoners their change of clothes. They bring the meals. They escort these prisoners to recreation or to the showers, those types of things. That's the detention side of the operation. The other part of the operation is the intelligence gathering operation. Their job is to extract information from these prisoners, interrogate them. So you find interrogators in this part of the operation, both federal and military. As a chaplain, I was of course assigned to the detention side of the operation, because it would be unethical for a chaplain of any denomination to assist interrogators in extracting information from prisoners. So I was assigned to the detention side of the operation, alongside the guards, to help relieve much of that tension which existed between the prisoners and the guards, and to help make that part of the operation run much more smoothly. But I was able to gain an understanding of what was going on inside this intelligence operation, even though I was far removed from it. And even though I personally chose never to witness or observe an actual interrogation, I stayed far away from that part of the operation, knowing I may be breaking ethical boundaries as a chaplain. But what did I learn about what was going on inside that part of the operation from the prisoners who came to me with their concerns and complaints? Many of them often confirmed by the translators who translated for these interrogations. And again, many of these translators were part of my congregation back on the base. The prisoners would tell me many, many, many things about how they were being treated or about how they were being mistreated and abused. But what was most disturbing to me as a chaplain was learning how religion was being used in Guantanamo as a weapon. I call it a secret weapon. Guantanamo's secret weapon. Gitmo's secret weapon. Gitmo's secret weapon was, in my view, the use of religion against these prisoners, to try and break them, whether it was in the course of detaining them or whether it was in the course of interrogating them. And because each and every one of these prisoners was a Muslim who believes in one God, it was the use of Islam, the religion of Islam, against these prisoners. Now, how was that being done? Prisoners would tell me that they would be taken to the interrogation room, a particular interrogation room. And when they were taken, they were, of course, shackled at the wrist, the waist, and at the ankles. That's how prisoners in Guantanamo are shackled. And they would describe this particular interrogation room having marked on the floor a circle, a large circle. And in the center of that circle was also marked something else. Another symbol. It was the symbol of Satan. The pentagram symbol of Satan in the center of this circle. So it was a satanic circle. And the interrogators would take this prisoner who believes in one God and attempt to force him to bow down and prostrate in the center of this satanic circle. Perhaps you've seen when Muslims pray, we bow down and we prostrate our head to the ground in the form of the Islamic prayer. The interrogators would attempt to force these Muslim prisoners to prostrate in the center of this satanic circle, while they would scream at the prisoner that Satan is your God now, not Allah. Allah meaning God the Almighty, God the creator of all things, the heavens and the earth. This is how religion was being used to directly attack the prisoner's faith and integrity, to degrade him, to humiliate him. This was one way. Another way in which religion was being used against these prisoners was when we first heard from Newsweek magazine back in 2005, which reported that interrogators were taking the Quran and flushing it down the toilet. The news was the Quran was being desecrated down in Guantanamo. And that led to riots all over the Muslim world, where people were even killed in these riots in protest of this news that the Quran was being desecrated. Well, while in Guantanamo, as the Muslim chaplain assigned to this prison operation, I can't necessarily confirm the specifics of that Newsweek report. I can confirm that the Quran was being desecrated and abused in many, many different ways. And why is this important? Well, the Holy Quran for Muslims all over the world is considered to be the literal words of God. In a Muslim's home, they'll put the Quran on the highest shelf in the house. They'll never place the Quran in anywhere that's dirty or filthy. A Muslim student will never take the Quran and place it under his or her chair, because then you would be sitting over the Quran and that would be disrespectful to the words of God. You find a similar tradition in our sister Abrahamic faith, Judaism. If you go into a Jewish synagogue, where do you find the words of God? At the front of the synagogue, under what's known as the Ark. Usually under lock and key. And maybe it's only the Jewish rabbi who's actually allowed to handle the Holy Scriptures or even script it. And this is out of respect, reverence for what's considered to be the words of God. In Islam, we have this same tradition as well. In Guantanamo, what was happening is because they knew how Muslims revered the Quran, they used it as a weapon. It happened, for example, in the detention blocks, in these open-air cell cages that these prisoners were being held in. When the guards searched through the cells, they would search through all the items, every prisoner was allowed to have a Quran. And that was actually promoted in the media. Every prisoner is allowed to have a Quran. Look how sensitive we're being to the Muslim prisoners here. But when the guards got to the Qurans to search, they would turn them upside down, shake them violently to see if something dangerous would fall out. But in the process, maybe the pages were torn, the bindings were ripped, and then they were recklessly thrown on the floor and moved on to their next item. And because the prisoners were in these open cells, they could see how the guards conducted their searches. And when the prisoners saw the Qurans being tossed on the floor, pages ripped, they became furious, angry, and they protested by banging on their steel beds or banging on their steel doors in protest, demonstrating, rioting against the Qurans being recklessly abused by the guards. Now, of course, in any prison operation, there is a need for proper security operations. Certainly cell searches, as you would find in any prison operation. But the manner in which the Qurans were being handled was disrespectful to Muslims who considered the Quran to be the Word of God. But these protests then became much more extreme. They turned into hunger strikes. Then they turned into suicide attempts, mass suicide attempts. Prisoners tried to hang themselves in protest that the Holy Quran was being desecrated. These more extreme protests occurred after it was learned by everyone in the entire camp, prisoners and U.S. personnel, that interrogators were taking the Holy Qurans into the interrogation room in front of the shackled prisoner, throwing it on the floor, stepping on it, kicking it across the floor. Some of them sat on it. And now you can find in official military investigations that have been conducted into abuses of the Quran down in Guantanamo, that Qurans were even urinated on. This is what led to the massive riots, hunger strikes, and suicide attempts on the part of the prisoners, leading to a total chaos and loss of control. This was a problem for everyone in Guantanamo. Problem for Muslim prisoners, of course. Problem for American Muslims, who also did not appreciate hearing that the Holy Qurans were being desecrated. A problem for the guards, because who did the prisoners take their anger out on after the Qurans were abused in the interrogation rooms? They took it out on the guards, and the guards couldn't control them, even within their own cells. It was a problem even for the intelligence gathering operation and the interrogators. Why? Well, they quickly realized what would happen if a prisoner did commit suicide. What would that mean? What would be the consequence? These intelligence officers realized that if a prisoner committed suicide and ended up dead in his cell, he could no longer be considered what we all in the military called intelligence assets. The prisoners were intelligence assets. Why? Because they were interrogated. But if he's now dead from committing suicide, how much more information will you gain from that prisoner? None. And that would be a problem for the intelligence operation. This was a problem everyone wanted to solve. They didn't know what to do. They would next turn to me, the Muslim chaplain, and they would say, "Chaplain, what do we do? How do we solve this problem? We don't want prisoners committing suicide." One of the simple things that I did was actually author a policy, a standard operating procedure. That's what we call it in the military. It was a simple policy that allowed the prisoner himself, from within his own cell, to show the guard, look, there's nothing hidden in the Quran. And then it would be stored high up in his cell in a little cloth holder, and then be off limits to the guards when they conducted their search. And if that prisoner needed to be taken out of his cell to be escorted to recreation or to the shower or to the interrogations, for those were the only places that a prisoner would go outside his cell, he would be shackled through the slot in his door at the wrist, at the waist, and at the ankles. And only then, after he's already shackled, is the door of his cell unlocked and that prisoner let out and escorted. So if there was a possibility that that prisoner was able to hide something in the Quran, by the time the door of his cell is unlocked and opened, he's already shackled, and the likelihood that he could then go and retrieve that something in the Quran would be virtually impossible. My policy took into account, one, respect, proper handling of the Holy Quran, relieving much of that anger and tension from the prisoners. And it also took into account proper security, which I mentioned is necessary in any prison operation. These are the types of contributions that I would receive recognition and praise for from the command down at Guantanamo, even getting 2 official military awards for my service in those 10 months. Would later even be recommended for a 3rd higher award. But that was a second particular way in which religion was being used to attack the prisoner. Another way is how the command in Guantanamo would exploit a particular aspect of Muslim culture. And that aspect is when you look at a conservative Islamic society, you find a separation between the sexes, between men and women. Limited contact, physical contact between members of the opposite sex in public. Even limited handshaking, for example, between men and women who are not married or are not family members. Out of respect for one another, out of modesty for one another. This is behind that separation. It might be deemed disrespectful, for example, for a man to shake the hand of a woman that's not his wife. That would be disrespectful to that woman's husband, and it might be disrespectful to that own man's wife in a conservative Islamic society. But this aspect of the Muslim culture was exploited down in Guantanamo, in particular when they would employ their female interrogators. Female interrogators in an interrogation operation that was very competitive. In an interrogation operation that had an enormous amount of pressure, right from the Secretary of Defense himself, to get information from these prisoners. But in this competitive interrogation operation, these female interrogators thought they had an advantage over their male counterparts. And what was that? Their sexuality. Knowing that these prisoners, many of them, came from conservative Islamic societies. They were very ready to conduct some of these interrogation sessions, stripping off their clothes naked in front of that Muslim prisoner, thinking that would frustrate him, thinking that would help that female interrogator gain information from that prisoner. But they would go further. They would inappropriately rub their bodies on these Muslim male prisoners. They went further than that. Some of them would give lap dances to these prisoners in Guantanamo. Free lap dances. Where can you get a free lap dance these days? In Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, if you're a Muslim prisoner. But in all seriousness, down in Guantanamo, these female interrogators went further than that. And it's indicated in the FBI memos that have now been disclosed due to FOIA requests, FOIA lawsuits, Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, forcing the disclosure of some of this information, and also indicated in the official investigations into abuses down in Guantanamo that female interrogators would even go as far as grabbing the genitals of these Muslim male prisoners while they were interrogating them. This was, of course, to humiliate them, to sexually harass them, and this was to exploit that aspect of Muslim culture. I would raise concerns when I heard about these reports, not only from the prisoners, but also from American translators who were involved in translating these sessions, to my chain of command. Why? Well, as a U.S. citizen, as an officer in the Army, a person from a nation that is supposed to have this value of religious freedom, as found in our First Amendment, the free exercise of worship. From a nation which was founded on the very first cause of religious freedom, like when the Pilgrims came and landed on Plymouth Rock, were searching for something. What was that something? Religious freedom. The very, very first cause here in this country was religious freedom. But now in Guantanamo, as a chaplain whose role is to defend religious freedom, to help accommodate religious practices for military service members, for people who serve on military installations, and for people who may be imprisoned by the military. I found this violating our own national values and would raise concerns to my chain of command. But not only because of that, I raised these concerns because as the prisoners got out of hand, uncontrollable in the prison cell blocks, I was able to give an understanding to the detention commander of why his guards could no longer control the prisoners. And he valued that input, and we were able to solve and resolve some of the problems that occurred in the prison cell blocks. But unfortunately, there was another chain of command on the intelligence side of the operation from which we were far removed and had no control. So the abuses in the interrogation rooms continued to occur, continued to foster. And actually, when you look at Guantanamo, most of the abuses, the worst abuses, occurred in the intelligence gathering operation, not in the detention operation. That's a little bit different than what we know of at Abu Ghraib. At Abu Ghraib, we saw the abuses being carried out mostly by the guards, those guards who have been convicted or disciplined for the scandal at Abu Ghraib. We still don't know the involvement of the intelligence officers and interrogators as to what extent of abuse occurred in the interrogation rooms at Abu Ghraib. Perhaps it's much, much worse than we've seen from those Abu Ghraib photos. But in Guantanamo, it's clear that the worst abuses occurred in the interrogation section and not the detention side of the operation. I raised concerns about some of these things to my chain of command, for which they valued that input and would further recognize me for that. I would receive a stellar officer evaluation report for the 10 months that I had served, dated 2 days before I would leave Guantanamo for what we call R&R, rest and relaxation in the military. That was something I thought was given to me also as further reward for the contributions that I was making down in Guantanamo. But not only did I raise concerns about those types of things, but I would raise concerns, for example, about prisoners' ages, for example. Because in Guantanamo, I learned that there were prisoners who were as young as 12 years old. 12 to 14 years old. There were prisoners from Afghanistan who were as young as 12 to 14 years old held in Guantanamo. These few were held in a separate facility. But there were several others who were certainly younger than 18, maybe about 15 or 16, that were being held in general population. And I would talk to my superiors about whether or not it was even appropriate to have prisoners that young in Guantanamo. Things like that. But nevertheless, I received that R&R. And I was on my way home to visit my family for 2 weeks, thinking that after 10 months of serving in Guantanamo, doing a good job, getting awards, receiving an officer evaluation report, which would surely get me promoted, I got R&R to visit my family, knowing that after 2 weeks I would be back in Guantanamo, finish those last 2 months, completing 1 full year of duty in Guantanamo, and then I would be finished and head back to Fort Lewis. But when I landed in Florida, Jacksonville Naval Air Station, the first stop where service members serving in Guantanamo come back into the country, I was met by some people. Customs officials first. I recall on the plane where we all sat when we landed on the flight line. Customs and immigration agents came on the plane and asked to see everyone's identification. I recognized that they were looking for me. Because when I got off the plane, I was immediately approached by other customs officers who said, "We want to search your bags." And I said, "Okay, search my bags." But we had to go to the flight line where the luggage was being downloaded off the flight. And when we got there, there was a big pile of bags, all the luggage. I was thinking I might have to go through this pile to find my bags. But I didn't, because there were already 2 bags set aside, and they just happened to be mine. Well, it made it very easy for me to grab my bags and give them to the customs officer. And then he would search through them, taking me into a back room. And then he would search through my backpack. And then he would claim that he would find some suspicious documents. That's what he called them. Suspicious documents. And then all of a sudden there were intelligence officers there, military, NCIS, Army counterintelligence. And then, yes, also the FBI was there. And they would all question me and also search through my belongings, seizing most of it, about 80% of it. And then they would say of these suspicious documents, they were classified documents. They said I was carrying classified information, classified documents. And then they ran and they got an arrest warrant. And I was arrested that afternoon, in secret. Nobody knew I had been arrested. I never made it back to Seattle, Washington, where I was supposed to have met my wife and daughter. I never showed up. It was like I had disappeared. They had no idea what had happened. My wife got worried, was crying at the airport. She called my home, and my parents' home in New Jersey, to see if maybe they heard from me, or maybe my plans had changed. My parents hadn't heard anything. It was like I was missing from the face of the earth. But my family, they did learn later what had happened to me. About 10 days later, when they saw me on the news, I was the news of that day in September, that the Muslim chaplain of Guantanamo Bay had been arrested, was now sitting in a super maximum security prison in Charleston, South Carolina. And I was being accused of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition. All of these offenses which I just mentioned are capital crimes that carry the death penalty. And I was actually threatened by military prosecutors with the death penalty in the days following my arrest. But now I was in this maximum security prison, in isolation, solitary confinement, in this place called, or known as, the Consolidated Naval Break. The Consolidated Naval Break. The very same facility in which our government holds U.S. citizen enemy combatants. Foreign enemy combatants, we know, are held down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and in those secret CIA black sites. But if you're declared an enemy combatant by our U.S. president, and you're a U.S. citizen, you get sent to the Consolidated Naval Break. And that's where I was sent. There were names of people like Jose Padilla, Yasser Hamdi, the two noted U.S. citizen enemy combatants, were held in that very same prison while I was there. But the U.S. military would say in an interview, a public affairs officer from the U.S. military would say in an interview that me being sent to that facility was only a coincidence. He said it was only a coincidence. But I know it wasn't a coincidence. Because when they took me from Jacksonville to Charleston, they threw me in the back of this truck. I was shackled at the wrist, the waist, and the ankles, just like prisoners in Guantanamo are shackled. And the military calls this form of shackling putting the subject into a three-piece suit. That's what they call it. Put him in a three-piece suit. And when I heard that, I'm thinking that they had got a suit from the mall made by Armani. And that would at least look nice. No, it wasn't a three-piece suit like that. A three-piece suit of chains, where I was shackled in 3 places. That's what I was shackled in. Just like the prisoners in Guantanamo. And in the back of this truck, there was an armed guard. 2 other armed guards in the front. One of them was driving. That armed guard next to me would take out of his bag these goggles. And they were painted black. And then he put them on my eyes. Now I couldn't see anything. In the back of this truck, he would then take out these heavy industrial type ear muffs, ear protection like devices, and put them on my ears. Now I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. And I was shackled like a prisoner in Guantanamo. I was being subjected to something which we call sensory deprivation. That's the technical term. Sensory deprivation. It's done to instill fear and intimidation and confusion. But guess what? I knew about this tactic. How? When I saw the prisoners being transported to Guantanamo, in process, they were all subjected to this very same tactic of sensory deprivation. And this became scary for me. Knowing that my own government was quite possibly at this time stripping from me all of my rights, all of my individual rights, all of my legal rights, maybe all of my human rights, because this was the interpretation of the administration, that these prisoners in Guantanamo who are enemy combatants do not have any rights. And I recognized that I was being treated just like them, perhaps even being considered an enemy combatant. Maybe I was. I don't know. But nevertheless, when they threw me in this cell in Charleston at the Consolidated Naval Brig, I was at least relieved that I was still alive. I was in that cell for 76 days, as the accusations were swirling that I was a terrorist spy, thinking that I could quite possibly be convicted wrongly of capital crimes and then be put to death. But after 76 days, I was suddenly released. I was never actually charged with these heinous crimes, capital crimes, not one of them. But they would charge me with lesser offenses which they called mishandling classified information. I was still facing about 13 or 14 years in prison. I was out, though, ready to go to a pretrial hearing, but now at least I've had the opportunity and given the right to retain an attorney, a military law expert. I retained a civilian attorney, a military law expert named Mr. Eugene Fidel, who today is the head of the National Institute of Military Justice. Him and his colleague was my counsel, providing me legal counsel for that ordeal. And we went to this pretrial hearing, and one of the first things we did was we demanded that the military or the government turn over to us the results of any official review that they had conducted of anything that they had seized from me to show that I indeed had something classified, simply to substantiate these lesser charges that they had brought against me. And the response was from the government, we haven't even conducted such a review. So what had happened? I had been arrested in secret, separated from my family, treated like an enemy combatant, subjected to sensory deprivation, locked away for 76 days in solitary confinement, accused of being a terrorist spy, and then charged with lesser offenses of mishandling classified information, and the government hadn't even shown definitively that I had anything that was classified. So what do you think happened next? There was a delay in this pretrial hearing. There were several delays after that, about 5 or 6 more times, as they conducted an all-out investigation to find a shred of classified information, to hold it against me, to hold me accountable, or maybe to save face. But now it wasn't just a few papers that they had seized from me at the airport that day, but now it was literally tens of thousands of papers they were sifting through that they had seized from federal raids, like on my residence in Washington State, like on my residence in Guantanamo, a federal raid from my office in Guantanamo, a raid of the Muslim chapel at Fort Lewis, where I had served prior to going down to Guantanamo. All of these places were raided by military and federal agents, and there were literally tens of thousands of papers that they were now investigating to substantiate these charges that I had mishandled classified information. And after months of investigation, what happened next? Even these lesser charges simply were dropped. They disappeared. I was sent back to duty, reinstated as a Muslim chaplain back at Fort Lewis, Washington. And then I would resign my commission from the U.S. military. And I received in January of 2005 an honorable discharge. And when I separated, I even received a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for, quote, exceptional meritorious service. How do you figure that out? A gross miscarriage of justice. That's how you figure it out. And many people say, well, why do you think it happened to you? Why did this happen to you? I think it happened for 3 reasons. Simple three reasons. I'm an American Muslim in a very dangerous post-9/11 era where the civil liberties of everyone have actually been eroded. But the Muslim community is under that much more scrutiny today, as people have this misconception that Muslims are somehow naturally inclined to violence and terrorism, not understanding Islam, the religion, or the Muslim culture. When people saw me in Guantanamo praying, bowing and prostrating in the form of the Islamic prayer, when they saw me read the Holy Quran in the classical Arabic language, they recognized how this mirrored the prisoners, the Muslim prisoners, when they prayed and read the Holy Quran. And they'll tell you that's how Muslims all over the world pray and read the Holy Quran. But to those few individuals in Guantanamo, whether it was due to their ignorance or lack of knowledge, or hypervigilance, giving them the benefit of the doubt, or even if it was due to their sheer bigotry, it meant to them that I was also the enemy. And being a Muslim, it made them easy to target me. But I believe it also happened because of my ethnicity, being a Chinese American. I learned through the information that my attorneys gathered that one of the initial allegations against me was, quote, "Who the hell does this Chinese Taliban think he is, telling us how to treat our prisoners?" I was called a Chinese Taliban, and I was telling them how to treat prisoners humanely. I wasn't just called a Taliban, but I was called a Chinese Taliban. A clear indication that someone was disturbed by my Chinese ethnicity. And the last reason why I believe this happened to me was because of my patriotism. As it's indicated in the title of my book, For God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. My patriotism was under fire. As a Muslim chaplain, as a military chaplain, as a U.S. citizen down in Guantanamo, what was I doing except advocating for American values like religious freedom, religious accommodation, humane treatment of prisoners, justice. These are American values which we need to uphold and grasp onto. But by raising concerns about how prisoners were being treated, mistreated, abused, people were threatened. Those people who were engaged in those abuses, in that gross conduct, which perhaps in the future may be deemed as war crimes. And they would come after me and target me. That, in short, is my story. That's my experience being a chaplain in the U.S. military, having served in Guantanamo. It's a story that I believe is relevant to the atmosphere that we live in today, to the issues of Guantanamo and the realities of what occurs in that prison camp, and why it's such a controversy. And in my view, Guantanamo Bay needs to be closed, must be closed. And that is the first step to restoring our national reputation as a leader in human rights, as a country that is recognized around the world as one that will uphold international law. Because today, Guantanamo contributes to that anti-American sentiment, that growing anti-American sentiment, and the hostility towards our nation. Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, Iraq, and other things are all contributing to recruitment of extremism and terrorism. Guantanamo has to be closed. And it's an issue that has to be dealt with whoever takes office of the presidency in 2008. I want to open the floor to questions. But before I do, I want to actually show you some images of Guantanamo, so you have an idea of what it looks like at this prison camp. So with that, I'll close just by saying that my name is James Yee, the former U.S. Army Muslim chaplain of Guantanamo Bay, and it's been a pleasure sharing with you my experience. Thank you very much. I hope that my talk today really is one that has opened the eyes of many of you, and especially the students who are here, as the students in this room really are the next generational leaders and could really have an impact on the direction of our nation in the future.
Were there other chaplains there in addition to yourself representing the Jewish faith or the other Christian faith?
Were there other chaplains there? Yes, there were other chaplains there. There was a Catholic priest, a couple other Protestant chaplains. But when I got to Guantanamo, they were restricted from going into the actual prison camp. Why? Because shortly before I got there, one of the Protestant chaplains who was in the camp held an interview with some of the media who visited and said, 5 of the prisoners have converted to Christianity. And I believe that their conversion to Christianity is sincere, because why would they threaten their own lives amongst these Muslim terrorists?
After that, the commander banned all chaplains from the camp except the Muslim chaplain. It was like a public affairs nightmare. With regard to the Jewish personnel who served at Guantanamo, prior to me getting to Guantanamo, also there was a problem with the Jewish personnel. During the high holy days, the permanent chaplains assigned to the Guantanamo base, not to the Joint Task Force prison operation, had refused to bring Jewish chaplains or rabbis down for the high holy days to serve the Jewish personnel, Jewish personnel. And they went and called their congressman, started a congressional, and then it was a big problem about not accommodating the Jewish personnel down in Guantanamo.
I've got some questions about the picture that you showed there of the inmates being subject to sensory deprivation torture.
Sensory deprivation.
Right. Well, sensory deprivation has been judged as torture by the International Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. The British were convicted of doing it against Irish detainees, members of the Irish Republican Army who were not an army. Now, were you aware of this before you went down to Guantanamo?
The sensory deprivation, no.
Did you ever object to it as a Geneva Convention or UCMJ violation?
I had no idea what the legal ruling was of sensory deprivation.
Did you ever hear of any officer or enlisted personnel complain about it as a DC or UCMJ violation or 4810 violation?
Not specifically sensory deprivation, but there was a commanding colonel of the detention operation who refused to stay down in Guantanamo any longer because his view was that Geneva Convention should apply according to him as a military police officer, and he left. He was sent away.
Now, it seems to me that
It's interesting your observation about sensory deprivation. I was subjected to it, and it's actually technically considered torture. Then many people ask me, were you tortured? So yes, I answered the
but you
question.
were only under sensory deprivation for what, a couple of hours?
During the transport down to Georgia.
Right. It normally takes about 24 hours to bring somebody into sensory deprivation.
Yeah, I've seen some reports from a professor. He researches the history of torture in the U.S.
Dardis Rajali?
Not him, but from I think Wisconsin is from. He's got a book about it. He talks about the sensory deprivation and all the aspects of the interrogation tactics that have been approved. But real quick, you have a question?
Yeah. Now, the United States my understanding of how the United States military works is that it is pretty much impossible for the military to work fast enough to implement a policy and implement standard operating procedures and train personnel to introduce sensory deprivation torture as a routine in the time between 9/11 and 3/02 when this picture was taken. Did it ever occur to you that the United States Army and the United States government started during peacetime the implementation of torture as a policy and the abandonment of the Geneva Convention?
I believe the reason why they put the prison in Guantanamo was to try to avoid Geneva Conventions. Do I know when they started this aspect of tactic of sensory deprivation? No, but it's my assumption that the soldiers and the guards who were transporting these prisoners were told, treat them like this, gag them up, eyes them, so they were just following orders.
Certainly, but when were those orders issued?
Good idea.
To talk. Thank you. Thanks.
Those questions are probably, if I was someone who was making the policy or involved at that level, but I was at the ground level as a chaplain. So, great questions for someone like George Bush.
Hello, sir. I would like to ask you about those kids that you mentioned. Have you seen those kids? Did you see them?
I used to meet with them on a weekly basis. I was allowed access into their.
So we have child labor laws, but we don't have anything against those 12-year-olds that we can.
What's interesting in Guantanamo, even when we talk about labor laws, the people who work down in Guantanamo, many of them from other countries like Jamaica and the Philippines, who do the cashiers at McDonald's or the post exchange down at Gitmo, they do maintenance and whatnot, they get paid like less than $2 an hour because there's no minimum wage down in Guantanamo. So there's exploitation of even civilian workers
from who are down in Guantanamo. But you raise a valid point of the child labor laws, but yet we have prisoners as young as 12-year-old. We had prisoners as young as 12 down in Guantanamo. And another interesting thing is the first prisoner that is going to go to trial for any crimes under the Military Commissions Act was 15 when he was captured. And there's some controversy over whether or not we're setting a very dangerous precedent as a nation to try a juvenile for war crimes as an adult. I don't know if that's been done before. Yes, sir. Yes.
After everything that you've lived through, do you think that we as Muslim Americans can really believe that we have any civil rights in this country?
Do we have civil rights in this country, whether you're Muslim or not Muslim? Sure, we do have rights. But I think we have to protect those rights. As the people, we have to protect those rights and fight against whatever parts of the government want to try and take them away. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have, if I wasn't afforded the right to an attorney, or due process, or a day in court. I mean, when you look at what happened to me and how so grossly wrongly accused I was, but yet not my day in court, and was able to show and prove my innocence and get exonerated. If you compare that with prisoners in Guantanamo, they're not getting their day in court. They're mostly held indefinitely, without charge, under no real just judicial review. And that's the problem. One of the problems. They're right here in front.
I believe that the Bush administration wants to demonize Muslims. And the reason it wants to demonize Muslims is if the Muslims can be thought of as demons, then the population at large will support United States wars against countries which have Muslims. And having said that, what do you think about my opinion?
I think in some sense, I won't say just necessarily the Bush administration, but I think in some sense, in many, many ways around the world, Islam has been demonized. Just like communism, during the communist era, Russia was demonized, and we saw it. Like you see it, we saw it in Hollywood, in the films, in Rocky, for example. So you have this demonization of an enemy, so that public support will back the government when it wants to carry out these things. And I think that played a role. Muslim soldiers have come to me with concerns, for example, when they go through basic training, and the scenario is, kill the Haji, kill the Haji. So this is ingrained even in military training scenarios.
And of course, part of the demonization is beginning to demonize the culture or the religion.
All right, great. Thanks for your comment. But my response is basically education. That's what I try and do: educate others about the culture, about the religion. And I'm someone who believes very much so in the value of diversity, and believe that diversity is one of the greatest strengths, and that if we understand others, that is the only way that we'll actually be able to win their hearts and minds. Yeah, right here. Right.
Hi, my name is Chance Bertzel, and I'm a disabled Desert Storm Iraq War veteran. And I'd just like to provide a compliment to you on behalf of all of us soldiers and veterans and all of us U.S. citizens here in the United States of America. Thank you. You're here to speak.
Thanks for your support. Thanks for your support. Young lady here.
Make sense to me. You give it a strong prohibition against suicide.
Correct.
So that reaction.
Right, sure. In Islam, suicide is prohibited. And many people, when I talk about Islam or give an Islam 101, I get the question about suicide bombing. That's a whole issue in and of itself. But sure, in Islam, there's a prohibition against taking your own life, because essentially you've lost hope, you've lost faith, you lost faith in God. So yes, there is a prohibition. But in the military,
the chaplain is very often the commander's representative on suicide awareness and suicide prevention. And they get sent to suicide prevention training. And I was that person in my unit back at Fort Lewis. And had training in suicide prevention and suicide awareness. And mental health experts will tell you that suicide is done out of desperation. It's a mental disease. It's from depression, which is a disease. So when a person reaches that state of depression and they're willing to take their own life, they've gotten to a point where they've lost hope. They've lost self-worth. They've got this feeling of helplessness that no matter what happens, there's nothing that will help the situation. And people of all faiths commit suicide. And so, yeah, sure, there's a prohibition against suicide within Islam, but it's a mental, psychological issue. Right in front.
Did the government try to interrogate you at all during your 76 days in South Carolina? And if so, what sort of information did they try to extract from you?
The very first day I was arrested, I was interrogated by the FBI extensively, and to the extent that I allowed them to. I had agreed to talk to them, and that was perhaps one of my first mistakes. And it was interesting because after I was stopped and searched, and they actually seemingly had let me go on my own way. And as I was leaving the room, the FBI was there. They stopped and they said, we'd like to ask you a few questions. And I said, do I have to answer these questions? What if I don't want to answer your questions? Do I have to? And he said, nope. I said, so you're telling me if I want to walk out the door right now and keep going, I can? And he said, yep. And then I said, okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. That was one of my first mistakes. But I probably would have been stopped anyway by someone else. But I gave him 5 minutes. He started asking me questions. I was being interrogated there. And they were asking me all sorts of things about Guantanamo and what I did and what my role was with prisoners and, etc. And someone who's been trained on information in the military, classified or sensitive material, there are 2 criteria to have access to information. The first criteria is you must have an adequate clearance, security clearance. The second criteria is you must have what's known as need to know access. You must have a need to know that information. You must meet both of these criteria. I did not know these FBI agents. I never saw them in Guantanamo. They were actually never in Guantanamo. They were agents from Florida. And they assured me we have, top secret clearance. You can answer our questions. And I said, I don't know you, and you can't prove to me that you have a need to know access. So, sorry, I can't answer any of your questions. They were very frustrated. Very frustrated. They were later, when they interrogated my wife, they would tell her, your husband's not answering questions, he's not cooperating, it's not good for him, what can you tell us about him, and all of that. But, I didn't really answer their questions because, I didn't felt that they needed to know anything that was going on in Guantanamo. And suggested that if they wanted to know anything about what I did down in Guantanamo, to call Lieutenant Colonel. I gave them their phone numbers. Call them and ask them, and if you have a need to know that information, they'll give it to you. And so that was when I was interrogated that day. I had expected to be interrogated when I was put in prison in Charleston, but that didn't happen. It was once I got legal counsel, the first attorney that I met was, you don't talk to anyone.
So you got legal counsel right when you were put in the break in South Carolina?
No.
Or after your 76 days?
Actually, when I was still in Jacksonville, and in the military they have what's called a pretrial confinement hearing to justify keeping that person in prison. And I was given an attorney from the base at Jacksonville, someone who came to me and said, look, I'm not your attorney, but I was just asked to represent you for this pretrial confinement hearing. After this hearing on Monday, you'll probably never see me again. But look, you don't talk to anyone about anything. And by the pretrial hearing, I was then given a military attorney from Fort Stewart. And then I would eventually be given retained civilian attorney. Here in the Sac corner.
So the 76 days that you were incurred, you had some legal counsel shortly after the internment. Is that right?
Yeah, in some sense, yes. There wasn't much they could do. They had no idea what was going on. They were, the military attorneys that were assigned to me were well over their heads. By the time I met with the military attorney that was actually going to represent me, he was suggesting, he's like, I think you should really consider retaining a civilian attorney. He's saying, not that I'm not qualified or anything, but look, the decks are stacked against you.
Right. Did you ask earlier than the 76-day?
For an attorney?
Yes.
No, not specifically, because I actually thought, being very, very naive, I thought that when I got arrested, it was so ridiculous that the matter was going to be cleared up in a few days, if not hours. And I was like, just bring me back to the general of Guantanamo, explain what happened, and, this will be, chalked up as an inconvenience and, clear it up. But that didn't happen. I did have an incident the second day when I was still in Jacksonville. The NCIS agents came to the ones who arrested me, came to my cell. It was the only time they let me out of my cell not shackled. They told the guard, just let him out. They let me out of my cell. They sat down at the table, and they said, yeah, we came to talk to you. We just came to ask you permission to go into your quarters, your house at Guantanamo. And I said, wait. You want to go in my house down in Guantanamo? They said, yeah, we want your permission to go into your house in Guantanamo. And I basically said, well, that seems like a pretty big decision, and I'm not sure whether I should let you. But I said, if you advise me that I should be doing this, then I'll let you go. And they said, no, we're not advising you. We just want your permission. I said, you can't advise me if I should do this, if this is the right thing for me to do. They said, no, we're not advising you. We just want your permission. I said, well, if you can't advise me, maybe there's someone who can. And without that advice, I don't think I can make that decision. And they went on their way, and they didn't get my permission. But they got a search warrant from the base commander in Guantanamo, and they went in there anyway.
And the classified materials that we read about during this whole incident, which I followed pretty closely, considering where you graduated from, that was all bogus?
There was, in my view, I never had any classified information on me when I left the camp. Most of what they were information of what was in question was, for example, a stack of papers in my backpack on the country of Syria. At the time, I was enrolled in a master's degree program of international relations. I was in a course called the Middle East and Foreign Affairs. I had done the coursework. I had took the final exam. I had got the orders to deploy to Guantanamo, got a year extension to finish that paper. I had about 3 weeks left to get that paper written. I was fortunate to have had that R&R to complete that paper on, sometime during those 2 weeks I would have been home to get that last requirement in, but I never made it. I eventually finished that program. I got my master's degree in international relations in 2006. Following my arrest and release, I did get an extra 6-month extension and got that paper in, and unfortunately that was the only class of 12 courses that I got a B. Right here in front. We can continue. Are we over the time, or it's okay? Is it okay? I'm okay.
What was your reception like when you returned to Fort Lewis after being confined by the local military community?
What was my reception like when I returned to Fort Lewis, Washington, where I had previously been working before going to Guantanamo? Well, I got a very nice reception from the community when I got to the airport. The news was there. All the local affiliates were there. Chaplain, was coming home, and I had a great reception in the community. My wife was there, my daughter. When I got to Fort Lewis, the very first thing that happened the next day when I reported to work was I met my new battalion commander, and he slapped me this pseudo-gag order, warning me that if I spoke out, was critical of the United States Army, the Department of Defense, that I would find myself back under the UCMJ, the military justice system. So I was sort of gagged by the command there. They themselves were probably a little uncomfortable with me coming home, even though I had been cleared, and was still under scrutiny by the command when I was there. So it was pretty cold from the commanding general when I was there. I did have some support though from the chaplains that I was working with when I got back to Fort Lewis. I knew the public affairs officers very well because I had done all the media work post 9/11, and they from Fort Lewis, and they all knew me, and they told me too. They told me, said, we supported you, but because of our positions, what could we say? So they stayed silent. But in general, the command was very cold. And that was part of the reason why I then chose to resign, even after considering staying in the military, thinking I had gotten past this terrible ordeal and would continue to do the good things that I was doing in the military. One more question. So we have one and one.
If I could ask you.
Okay. So one and one.
Sorry. What reasons did you have for joining the U.S. military in the first place? I have two questions. And after your experiences, how have your views of the military and the U.S. government as a whole changed?
Okay. Why did I join the military? Very interesting question. I went to West Point. When you graduate West Point, you're commissioned as a second lieutenant. There's no tuition at West Point, but you pay back in time. And I had a 5-year obligation. But I wrestled in high school. I placed 4th in the state championships. And my wrestling coach, who was my mentor at that time, basically said, "You're going to West Point." And being a loyal team captain and wrestler on his team, that's where I went. And that's how I ended up at West Point and went on to be in the military. What's my views of the military today? I think one of the reasons why much of the military is so much in a mess in Iraq is because we don't have the necessary personnel, the subject matter experts in Islam and the Muslim culture. I was in many ways serving that in that type of capacity, and I believe that lack of knowledge, accurate information about Islam and the Muslim culture has really hurt us in the world and in Iraq. I always get the question, what would you say to someone who wants to join the military, or a young Muslim of your community who might join the military? And my response really is, my advice is the same to anyone. Before you actually sign the dotted line, know what you're getting into. Study it. Talk to people who've been in the military, who've retired from the military, who left the military, who are in the military, and get a better understanding of what it means to be in the military, because it's not like any other job. You can become a sales clerk at Macy's, you can become a doctor, an accountant, an engineer, you can become a teacher, you can become an attorney. And if you decide that that's not what you want to do, then you go and do something else. But in the military, you sign the dotted line and you're stuck for at least 8 years. You have an 8-year military service obligation. So know what you're getting into before you actually sign your name on the line. And that's my advice to those who consider joining. Okay. We have one more question. One and one.
Yeah. Excuse me. I wanted to take issue a little bit with what you said about how we demonize the communists, similar to how we demonize Muslims today.
Yeah, generation.
Yeah, and then I want to tie that back to how you finished your talk. When I was a kid, I was told that the Soviets were evil and we were good because they arrested people for no reason, spied on their own citizens, and locked them away in secret prisons.
Exactly.
And we didn't. And we were better because we didn't. And it was a matter of public policy that we were going to act differently than those evildoers over there.
Right.
Whereas today, it seems like our so-called cowboy foreign policy is more along the lines of...
And we find ourselves doing those things.
Right.
Exactly.
And damn it, if they killed 3,000 of our people, well, we're going to kill 6,000 of them. And I wanted to tie that into your talk with how have these attitudes of America as either the great Satan or shining city on the hill. How have those attitudes been conveyed to you through Muslims that you met at Guantanamo and elsewhere?
I'll say that for those who, if they didn't hate America before going to Guantanamo, you bet they hate America now. But sure, in terms of the Muslims that I meet, across the country, and for those who come from Muslim nations, sure, they're the hostility towards America, comes from how we carry out our foreign policy, in my view, for sure. And there are many people, not only Muslims, but non-Muslims, and even in countries like our closest allies who disagree with how we're handling our foreign policy. And I think that has a lot to do with the anti-American sentiment that has spread all over the world. I mean, I think we're at an all-time high, of being hated around the world because of, all the things that how we're carrying, where we're deploying our military, and the decisions that are being made regarding foreign policy.
Well, before we thank Chaplain Yee, I just want to tell you that signed copies of his book, Forgotten Country, are available at the Co-op East, right across the street. There's plenty of copies there that he's signed personally, so please go buy one. His book is amazing and a great story. And secondly, thank you very much, Chaplain Yee. Your story is amazing, and you are an amazing person, so we thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.